Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our presentation today on resilience, one that we're very excited. I know there's a number of people still jumping on, and so hopefully those that are fast arriving are able to log in and put all their questions on slido.com. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Eric Spent. I am the president and managing partner here at Commonwealth Financial Group. And on behalf of my partner, Rick St. Jean, and everybody here at CFG, we're excited to have you all join us today. And Dr. Brooks, if you wouldn't mind switching the slide forward there, we'll keep moving along. We're excited to have you all join us today on this, what we think is a very timely and important topic of resilience today. We're super excited to have Dr. Brooks join us. He is let me get up his background here. He is one of today's leading speakers and authors on the themes of resilience, motivation, school climate, a positive work environment, and family relationships. And during the past 40 years, Dr. Brooks has presented nationally and internationally to thousands of parents, educators, mental health professionals, business people. And he is renowned for the warmth and humor he uses to help bring his insights and anecdotes into life. I hope today's conversation is informal and full of humor, which we are certainly excited to go do. If we could slide forward here, our format today, just so we understand, the format that we're going to go to, of course I'm having, we're gonna have Dr. Brooks present for about a half hour today. And he's gonna take us through a deck just to give us some information and backdrop on the topic of resilience. And then the rest of the conversation is really gonna be a discussion where your questions, and many of mine, will be posed to Dr. Brooks, and we'll turn this into very much a discussion. As Andrew mentioned before, you can go to slido.com, and if you just punch in the access code there, CFG 2020, you'll be able to load your questions. If you see questions that you like on the screen, feel free to vote on them. That'll push them up towards the top, and I'll be able to read for him to answer or to comment on. Some of you that have been on Zoom before know you have this raise your hand feature. We're not going to use that today, just so we make sure we don't talk over each other. But so Slido is the method that we'll do. I started to have to really appreciate and development. All students for strategies.
We're having a little trouble with the sound.
You're having trouble.
Your audio.
Brooks, while I try to fix my audio, Dr. Brooks, you want to talk just briefly about the two charities? And then
certainly. First of all, let me thank you and Rick, Eric, and Jeff Barron. And I really appreciate your making donations of my names to two of my favorite groups here. One is Research ILD in Lexington, Massachusetts. They're located. They really help kids who have struggled with learning. And Wildflower is a group that really helps children and families where a child has lost a parent, and really help them in terms of funding camp experiences for them. They're both very worthy causes to me, and I appreciate your donating in my name to both of those groups.
I'm not sure if my speaker or my volume is working any better, but I will, as I try to fix it, I got a thumbs up from Rick, so I'm good. Two great organizations. We're happy to make a donation to those organizations to have Dr. Brooks speak for us today. We'll give you their contact info and a follow-up email at the end, and I would encourage everybody to support them. As you'll hear from Dr. Brooks, a great way to build resilience is to give to others. And so with that in mind, I will hand the conversation over to Dr. Brooks, and take it away.
Thank you so much. And I will just get going. What I want to do today is really, in one sense, to share, like in a half hour, a 40-year career. I've had as a psychologist and a 40-year interest in this topic of resilience, which I think is even more important today than maybe ever before. So I just want to start by giving just a very brief definition, because years ago, when I was co-editing a book, a textbook about resilience, I was really surprised to see there are many different definitions. So just for today's talk, as you could see, it's really the capacity to cope effectively with adversity. It doesn't mean you're not going to face adversity, but I always say resilient people see problems as things to be solved rather than overwhelmed by. We learn how to cope. And as I mentioned during this webinar, I'm going to examine a few key factors that I think contribute to resilience. And then, of course, I'll welcome the very specific questions I'm sure we're going to get. I want to start by talking about a concept that for me is vital, and it has to do with what helps people to be resilient. When psychologists started doing research on the topic a number of decades ago, they actually asked people who had overcome adversity, who were doing, much better in their adult lives than you would have ever predicted that they would do based on their childhood. Some had grown up in abusive homes, some had failed in school, some had really struggled with different issues. And what the psychologists did, they basically said, we could have never predicted based on how you were growing up, the experiences you had, that you would be as hopeful and as optimistic as you are today. What do you think was one of the most important things, even in a difficult childhood that you had, one of the most important things that helped you to be resilient today? In every study that was ever done, the first answer was almost always the same. They would say there was at least one person along the way who truly believed in me and stood by me. If it wasn't a parent, it was a teacher or some kind of mentor. And why I bring that up is all the people watching, you'll hear one of my main points is that we really can be that person. Now let me mention charismatic adult. One of my heroes in the field of psychology, his name was Julius Siegel. He died a few years ago. In an article he wrote more than 30 years ago, he referred to that person as a charismatic adult. Some people are not thrilled by the term charismatic because it could have different meanings, but his definition is nothing short of poetic. He says a charismatic adult is an adult from whom a child or adolescent gathers strength. So one of the things more and more I looked at as a therapist who has seen both children and adults in my practice had to do with how do we provide that strength to help people to go on. And in my work, I've gotten really two main questions related to charismatic adults, among others. Do we as adults need charismatic adults in our life? Because Siegel talked about children needing it. And although I kid about a little, I'm really not kidding when I say, unless you've decided to be a hermit, we all need people as sources of strength in our life. As a matter of fact, I'd like those viewing this to think about this. Who was a charismatic adult in your life growing up? Who is a charismatic adult now? Who would you turn to? Who do you get strength from? And you could look in terms of the workplace, you could look in terms of your family. And then one of the questions I always ask, who would consider you a charismatic adult in the workplace, at home, and who gathers strength from you? So one of the questions is, we certainly do need, throughout our lifespan, people from whom we gather strength. The second question I often get, and it may seem so obvious, is can we help others to basically be, resilient if we ourselves do not feel very resilient? And it seems like during this pandemic, even when I'm asked to speak specifically about helping kids be resilient, I like to talk about what do we do to help ourselves be resilient? Because if we're feeling stressed out, it's very difficult then to follow through and help our kids to be resilient. So let's look at then what is basically the attitude or mindset of a charismatic adult, and what do they do? And this is going to be a quick summary. I know later my website address will be up again. I have close to 200 articles posted on my website, briefer articles. Almost everything I'm going to discuss briefly here, there are these articles if you want to certainly do more follow-up reading. Now I'm looking at the mindset or attitude or outlook of what I feel is important in terms of being that charismatic adult and also being resilient. I probably always list this one first. In all of my books about resilience, I talk about the importance of personal control because I feel if this is not here, and I will define it in a moment, if we don't possess personal control, it is very difficult to deal with life's adversities. And some have said it's almost like, it has some association with the Serenity Prayer, to expend our time and energy on situations over which, we have some influence rather than on situations that are beyond our control, to strive to become the authors of our own lives. And let me explain this. As I reflect on my career as a psychologist and as a therapist, as I look at what really adds to someone's anxiety or their depression, I will say this, and I've seen this in both children and adults. So many people spend so much time trying to change things they have no control over. I'll hear this: if only my husband acted this way, if only my wife acted this way, if only this, if only this. And one of the things I realized is the following: that it is difficult to be resilient if you're looking for your happiness by someone else changing first. And in that way, I started to write about and say, whether we realize it or not, we have more control over things in our lives than we may realize. And that's when I said, with the authors of our own lives. As a matter of fact, when I do therapy, especially with my adult patients, I'll almost view, our lives as a script. And if you don't like the current script, I'll say, well, what would the next script be? What would you like in this situation? And I'm always reminded, one of my favorite books on this topic, which is one book I've actually read about 6, 7 times. I'm sure a lot of people who are listening, you read a book, you say, I should go back to it, it's very good. And then you see the 30 books you haven't read. Was Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. He was a psychiatrist and a Holocaust survivor. And in that book, he really says something which so resonated with me. And basically he said, what we have control over, even in a situation that seems uncontrollable, like in a concentration camp, is we have control over our attitude and response to things. And he has a very poignant paragraph where he said, even in the concentration camps, there are a few brave men, and I'm on the women's side, a few brave women, who would give away their last morsel of food to someone who is even more hungry than they were. They showed that the Nazis could take anything away from you but the last of the human freedoms, to choose your attitude, to choose your response in any given set of circumstances. And I realize some people may say that is so overly dramatic in terms of what we're facing, but the attitude is, if things come up that we have little control over, we have to develop a mindset, but what is it that we have control over? One of the things that really is making a lot of people so anxious, of course, is you take an event as COVID-19, which in my whole life is probably one of the most challenging events we have faced. And you have very little control. You see, you could say, I have no control over this. And things are coming down, the pike that I can't do this, I can't do this, I can't do this. But if you start feeling more and more you can't do certain things, then you start becoming paralyzed. As I mentioned at the beginning, resilient people see problems as things to be solved rather than overwhelmed by. So one of the things I've been saying during this pandemic is, there are a lot of things you do have control over. We may have no control over the emergence of COVID-19 coming in, but what we have control over as our response to it. So let me share then, what are some of the things we have control over? And all of these are for listeners to think about and reflect on in terms of your own life. The notion of positive relationships. Almost everyone mentions this. It really is rooted in the notion we all need charismatic adults in our lives. And as we'll see, we really have to serve as charismatic adults for others. Connections with others serve as a source of strength and a feeling we're not alone. This is very interesting. Even before coronavirus, I've been very interested in the whole topic of loneliness. And I remember writing an article on my website, this was well before coronavirus, where I don't know how they did this research, but they found loneliness was the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. I'm not sure exactly how they did this research. And Theresa May, when she was Prime Minister of Great Britain, she actually appointed a minister of loneliness because she said, when you are lonely, it has such an impact on your emotional and physical well-being that we have to understand this. And in this connection, we have to think about how do we stay in touch with others? You know, I recently heard a news anchor on one of the local channels say, imagine if this had occurred like 25 years ago, the pandemic. Now we're able to do even this webinar. We're able to stay in closer touch with people. I always say, think about one or two people, a friend, a relative, who make sure you connect with them. I recently participated in something called the Global Stress Summit, and they had several people who really focused on this. And some of the questions were, well, what if you're an introvert? Well, if you're an introvert, we're not saying you have to go out and all of a sudden become an extrovert, but I hope there are at least one or two people you can turn towards. I would like all listeners to think about who is one person you've contacted to see if they're okay. Who has contacted you on that? And the other thing which makes it difficult is, you know, where I grew up in Brooklyn, we were all huggers. Everyone hugged in my neighborhood. If you didn't hug, I felt, you know, they didn't like you. Well, now you can't even do anything. You know, you're standing 6 feet away. So yes, there are adjustments being made. But I would like every person who's listening to think about, how am I dealing with social distancing so it does not become social isolation? How do I stay in touch? And actually, some kids are better at this than others. But just to give you one example, the Brooks family, which I think is rather close, scattered in about 7 states, Maine, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, Florida, Arizona, and Southern California. We would not have probably done this if there had not been the coronavirus. But here is a screenshot of all of these relatives in different places. It wasn't easy. We like to interrupt each other. One of my nephews, Larry, is a physician in LA, right on the front lines, and he just shared with us some of what he was going through, and it was just so nice to hear. People liked it so much that we scheduled another one in 2 weeks. Normally, we would not do this, but it was just nice to connect this way, and you know, you feel this source of strength. So one thing is the connections. This next thing is, again, a lot of this was even before I've been writing about this, the pandemic, but it's even more so now. Years ago, I read an article by a psychologist who said we really should practice TLCs. And I always thought of TLCs as tender, loving care, but as you can see, therapeutic lifestyle changes. This psychologist, whose philosophy was very similar to my own, basically said there are things that we could take care of. And I heard a physician talk about this too. There are things that are within our control. It's not that it's easy. If any of this was easy, I could tell my patients in the first session, practice personal control. And it doesn't work that way. You really have to adopt a certain mindset. So these, I just selected 5. All of these are within our control. Again, I want everyone to be, a whole other topic I've been writing about is self-compassionate. Give yourself some leeway during these difficult times. So if you're not following all of these practices, don't worry as much about it. So let's look at the 5 I selected. A structured day in a time when many of us are home, if we have children at home, our kids are home, this could be different things for different people. I have actually found when I work best, and I've been doing a lot of writing during this time as well, you get up, for me, the first thing I want to do is exercise, use the treadmill, do some weights, take a shower, and then eat breakfast. Other people want to do it in a different order, especially if you have kids at home. Try to have a certain structure, especially now that we know schools are closed for the rest of the year. Time for study, time to do certain things. You can be very flexible about this. You know, people have, just in today's Boston Globe, they talked about, you know, people wearing sweatpants or whatever. That is fine, but structure your day in a way. I have 2, I don't get that personal, basically 2 types of clothes. Right now with blue jeans and a shirt, and at night, once after dinner, I call it sweatpants. My wife calls it pajamas, but whatever. But I find the structure helps. Exercise. We all know this. And I'm not talking about training for the Olympics. A friend of mine, a psychiatrist, John Rady, wrote a book called Spark. This is years ago, where he found when children come into school, and if the first thing they do is aerobic exercise, they learn much more effectively rather than sitting at their desk. He also found that a certain amount of exercise, and we're not talking about 5 hours, 20 minutes, 30, actually for some people led them to be less depressed and less anxious. In some studies, even it was as powerful, if not more powerful than medication. Do the exercise you feel will be helpful. And nowadays, there are so many apps giving you so many different kinds of exercise. Build it in. Healthy diet. I always smile when I say this because I try to have a healthy diet, but just for all the people viewing, I know I exercise and use the treadmill every day so I can have a few chocolate chip cookies. But you know what? We have to have a little leeway here, but I think we know the importance of diet and to look at that. Adequate amount of sleep. You can Google this. There are actually now more and more techniques about helping us go to sleep. We also know what interferes with sleep, that we should not be, and I know a lot of people do, we should not be looking at our screens in bed right before we're going to go to bed. Just notions about certainly caffeine we all know about, or alcohol. Research that. You know, I've worked with people who have had difficulty falling asleep, and it just impacts so much. And again, it's not that easy necessarily to have an adequate amount of sleep, or probably even more important, amount of sleep that is really very restful. But there are things now. And this next one, here too, there are apps. Before the coronavirus, being on Twitter, I would tweet out links to articles about our own physical and emotional well-being. And I must say that so many of the articles had to do with meditation. I'm not an expert on meditation, but I'm telling you, you could get an app or you can go online, just even breathing in and out 10 minutes a day. The research is so excellent in terms of what that does for your health and relaxation. All of these, again, not necessarily easy to do, but I think we have to start adopting these things. This is just become a very key interest of mine. It started years ago when I was writing a book about school climate, and I was looking at what helps kids and teachers to really feel more comfortable and motivated in school. So I decided to give out a questionnaire to about 1,500 adults between the ages of 21 to about 75. And I asked this question, there were many, but the first one, of all the memories you have of school, what is your favorite memory? Something a teacher said or did, or an adult in the school said or did that boosted your motivation and your sense of dignity. Little did I know where this was going to lead. Probably the number one most frequent positive common memory of school was when you were asked to help out. I got answers like, I remember when a teacher asked me to pass out the milk and straws. I remember when a teacher asked me to tutor a younger child. And I remember when I got those, I said, that's what helps kids want to learn in school. Well, now, when school is in, and when I suggest a program for a child who's having trouble, one of the first things I say is there one thing this child feels he or she is doing in school which makes it a better place? But this led to something else. When I was writing a book about resilience in our adult lives through our senior years, there's a wealth of data that shows elderly people who are actively involved in helping others, even if you control for other things, lead longer lives. This has major implications right now. And every day we see people who are practicing this. I say to people, think about one way you are making a positive difference in the life of someone else. I see more and more people volunteering, doing charity work, raising money. But for those of you who have kids at home, do it as a family. It could be, let's raise money for a food bank. Let's do this. What it basically says, when you feel you're making a difference, it adds a sense of purpose. It's basically saying that because I'm on this earth, this earth is a better place, not in a narcissistic way, So I've been spending a lot of time on this because, again, even before the coronavirus, when people would say, how do you develop compassion and responsibility in kids? What I would say is don't lecture to them. Provide them with opportunities to help others. And even in our language, this was very helpful. So look at your day and how you structure your day, and part of it, see how you're really helping others to really to feel that they're making a difference. It's so powerful. We all want to feel we make a difference. Gratitude is something that is research that is being looked at more and more in the field of resilience. And it has two parts of it. The first thing is to consider things for which we are grateful. Years ago, some psychologists started research, especially with senior citizens and these were seniors who felt that they were, no longer useful, and they really questioned, what life was about. And what the psychologists did was to simply ask them, it could be every night, it could be every few nights, to sit down and write 2 or 3 things for which they are grateful, even though there are a lot of things they may not be. When I first started reading this research, shows you what I knew about this, I said, this almost sounds like a gimmick, but it's not denying what you may be unhappy about. What they found, and a lot of this now falls under the theme of or arena of positive psychology, just sitting down and writing a couple things you're grateful for is not ignoring some of the struggles, but it actually helped people to feel happier and more resilient. Because when you're in the midst of a lot of difficulty and challenges and stress, sometimes we forget about those things for which we are grateful. So that certainly, for me, is very important. And I'd like all the listeners to think about, put that down, even if it's every night, one thing, or every other day. What are you grateful for, even in the midst of all that is going on? And we now know that that is not just this gratuitous activity, but really can help. The second thing is to communicate messages of gratitude to others. This is also a very powerful kind of thing. Not only does it help the person who is communicating these messages, but the person receiving these messages. I always love it when someone emails me after I've given a talk or something and says, I'm sure you've heard this before, but you had an impact on my life, whatever. But I'll always write back and say, but I haven't heard it from you, and so thank you so much. And of course we want to hear that. Who's someone you work with that you write them a brief note? I learned this years ago when I was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Colorado Medical Center. I was in training and I was asked to do one of my first presentations. I wasn't used to doing presentations, and I spent a lot of time doing it. My supervisor, Hirsch Berkowitz, I remember him well, and he helped me. And then I made my presentation. I thought it had gone okay, but I wasn't certain. And later that afternoon, I came back to my office, and there in my mailbox was a little folded up note. It simply said, you did a great job today, Bob. You would have thought, for me, it was like he had written a dissertation about me. I folded up that note, and I must tell you, I kept it in my wallet for the rest of the year, and even when I moved back to Boston. And I remember at that point saying, even this message that he just wrote had such a meaning to me. And before I get another slide, I saw this, and I'm sure my grandson, Teddy, who just turned 16, has not read my work. But Teddy's been keeping somewhat of a diary. And the other day he wrote that he was feeling down, and he's a freshman at Needham High School. And he decided to write one of his middle school teachers. And so he wrote about it. And he said, I just want to thank you for what you did. And he even said, sometimes I felt you were hard on me. I think it was an English teacher, but I realized how much you cared about me. And what Teddy basically said, I asked him, he said he felt so much better writing that, and his teacher was so grateful. So think about these little notes of gratitude. It could be to anyone. It could be, your postal worker, anyone. It helps everyone. And the last thing I really want to talk about before we take questions is to appreciate the power of humor. we got into a long discussion about this in this global stress summit because there were people who have studied humor for years, and it's like, when you're in the middle of a crisis, is humor okay? Well, I think it has to be tasteful, certainly, and not everyone's going to necessarily appreciate humor, but I must tell you, I am getting more emails with cartoons having to do with the coronavirus that really are somewhat funny and uplifting. And as you can see, this goes back like 25, 30 years ago. I wrote a chapter about the importance of using humor in therapy. It could be at the workplace. It could be in our homes. And it doesn't mean you're a stand-up comic. You know, for me, humor also has to do with act childlike at times for adults, especially if they're kids and not childish. So it provides a sense of well-being during troubled times. And for the parents at home, you know, our kids are growing, so it's a little easier. But if you have kids at home, I get these notes from parents. I tell them, be self-compassionate. It seems like they're ready to, well, I hate to use the word, there's kill a kid that just, nothing seems to be going right. But then some people capture this humor. So I will show you this brief video.
Because of coronavirus, you are going to be quarantined, but you have a choice. Do you A, quarantine with your wife and child, or B?
Well, that didn't take long. And then there's this slide. Someone said me, my husband and I decided we don't want to have children. We will be telling them that tonight at dinner. And one could say, is this cruel? But we all feel these ways. We love our kids. So keep in mind also, and even in dire times, the use of humor appropriately used, we know how it actually connects people and how it can really help us. So these things we talked about, I think they're all doable. We have to keep it in mind. I try to keep it in mind. These are all things I feel we have personal control over. And as I'm ending, just think about, who are the charismatic adults in my life? Who do I turn to support? But how do I provide that for others? And when I've worked with the business leaders and whatever, how do you provide it for people who are on your team? How do you provide it for your clients? How do you provide it for your customers? It cuts across everything. So let me go to the next slide. Here is just further information about the next webinar that is going to be done. I just want to take
and just I'll just jump in real quick and
please do.
Say real quick. It was, as you said in the beginning, you take 40 years worth of research and expertise and pour it into a half an hour's worth of time. And so naturally, of course, there's a lot of questions. We will get to some of those questions as I start to see them popping up on Slido, but I did want to take a moment and just again, thank you, Dr. Brooks, for sharing your expertise and wisdom and diving into some of these questions in a moment. We will continue to provide some additional webinars as thought leadership for our community, I think in a way of building resilience for ourselves. We feel like providing and giving to others has been a source of strength for us. And so hopefully we're preaching some of the things that you talked about today. As a ton of questions.
Could I just thank you again for really providing this, because yes, and providing the donation, because it does capture. It was very meaningful to me when Jeff Barron approached me, and then we met Eric. Just know that your group is providing this, because and not just with me, but just it's a way of giving to others in that regard. So I personally want to thank you for having an opportunity to share some of these ideas with others.
We're glad to do it, and we're glad to have you. So we make the best use and get through as many questions as possible. I'll just dive right in.
Should I go ahead? Is there another slide or?
Nope, you're good. We'll leave this here.
Oh,
We'll
okay.
take here, and that way people have your contact information if they want it. Okay. One of the biggest questions that people are asking is, what recommendations do you have when surrounded by negative people? So if you're building resilience and you're trying to be positive, what do you do when you're surrounded by negative people?
Well, it depends who they are. Some people won't have as much contact, but some of the problems nowadays is in social distancing. Some of the people that we are not social distancing with, you could be our own family. I'm going to answer it in this particular way. We don't have control over another person's negativity. We may think we do, but we don't. But we can say things that help us. So It could even be, I'll give a couple of examples. Some other adult in your house, and they're being very negative. One could say, and you want to empathize, you never say you shouldn't feel that way. I always talk about what I call empathic communication, validate what they're feeling. You could say, I know how you feel that way. It's not how I feel. And distance yourself from that. So say to them, I know how you feel that way. And you could even say, I hope some point that you'll feel better about the things we could do about the situation. If it's a child talking to a parent, some kids will say, I feel miserable, I'm bored, I'm this, I'm this, I'm this. Whatever it is, all these negative feelings. Parents have to be careful. Again, no one wants to be told how they should feel. Maybe if you tried this activity, you wouldn't be bored, whatever. You say to them, it is a very difficult time. I am sorry you're bored. Then turn it into problem solving as much as possible. Don't get caught in the negativity. With kids, I often, when I've worked with parents, the kids will say, negative things. Parents can say, I know you feel that way, or during this pandemic, there's this crisis going on. Then turn it into problem solving. Let's try to think of one or two ways or things we can do to help make it better. Don't expect your kid to say, oh, finally you've seen the light and now you're asking my opinion. But it is amazing. I didn't have time to go into this, the whole notion of problem solving. But there's a psychologist friend, Myrna Shaw in Philadelphia, who has developed problem solving programs. She found even preschool kids who may be complaining and have problems, even preschool, as long as they're verbal. If you ask them what are some possible solutions, they can come up with some of the solutions. They may not be as well formed, but you know what? We have to take ownership for our own lives. And yes, it's so much better when you're with people who are very positive, because negativity could really bring negativity. But I will tell you, if you get sucked into that, it's very, very difficult. So just think about what you can do.
Yeah, that you referenced Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning as you were talking. It's one of my favorite books. And the quote that you referenced is one about, personal ownership of what you can control and not trying to, control what you can't control. So I think that makes sense. Another question here. What is, how's resilience different than perseverance? Are they the same word in your mind?
You know what? Part of, because, there's a whole notion of grit, which is perseverance and passion. For me, perseverance is part of resilience. To be resilient, you have to be able to persevere at a task. Because what I really couldn't get into as much, which is a major part also of, so this gives me a little opportunity of resilience, is persevering in the face of obstacles. As a matter of fact, one of the things I've been writing about based on some research that people have done is, and it has to do with your question on perseverance, there's a psychologist, Gabrielle Oettingen, who wrote a book, Rethinking Positive Thinking. And what she says is, if you're going to persevere, if you're going to move ahead, whenever you start a new task, a new strategy, this will not lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy. But what she says is, consider the obstacles in advance. Consider how you would respond to these obstacles. What she found is, you will be more likely to persevere and handle things if you think of the goals, you think of the obstacles, what obstacles may come up and how you're going to handle it, than if you just have certain goals and then don't anticipate the obstacles. Because then what happens is, you may be all excited about trying something new, it doesn't work, and some people, their immediate mindset is, see, it doesn't work. And they give up on things. So I see perseverance as one of the qualities within resilience. See, in my, and people go to my website on this, in my notion of resilience, I have things like perseverance. I have things like giving to others. I have things like compassion. So it's not just sticking with a task. It's also engaging in ways that are helpful, to others, and to help us to be more compassionate and caring. And some of that initial research, when people remembered these positive memories of school, of helping out, they said, wow, I remember, and just quickly, when my grandson Teddy, who I mentioned, when he was in preschool and I picked him up one day, I never know what to really say. I said, how was preschool, Teddy? Very good, Grandpa Bob. I said, what made it so good? I was the line leader today. And sometimes I said, what's a line leader? And he looked at me, he said, you lead the line. And then he said, I hope they let me do it tomorrow. Well, the reason I bring that up, there are all these different things from a very early age that we could build in where kids start feeling I'm making a difference. I'm contributing to things.
That's great. Another question here. I think especially in today's world where our commutes, my commute used to be an hour in the car. Today it's 10 minutes or 10 steps rather from my bed to my desk. So I think there's sort of this social conditioning to be working more and to be pushing through this challenging time. So do you have any tips to sort of unlearn the social conditioning that drives a bit of prioritizing the grind and cultural productivity over rest, as you mentioned in your talk?
I actually think this can be a wonderful time. You know, people have talked about how do you take these bad times and turn them into opportunities on this. And if you've been driven in terms of your work, whatever, and you're doing the same thing at home, this is really an opportunity, I think, if I'm understanding the question, Eric, to really step back, to structure your day, more. You have that extra, a lot of people have that extra time now where they don't have to drive, an hour to Boston or anything. I mean, the one benefit for me, I really miss all the talks that were canceled, but I don't have to go through TSA. I don't have to go through there. And I've actually probably been corresponding more with people who I haven't heard from in years. Your question also touches on what I just briefly mentioned, self-compassion. Self-compassion, which again is, I think, getting more publicity, is for people to be more compassionate about themselves, as the name implies, to really look at what are some of the things I could give up? What are some of the things that are not quite as important that I used to think were important? I think one could still be very effective at work, and certainly some of us, like myself, we have the option to work, from home. I can't give a talk in person, but I can give some through webinars. There are some people who, if anything, they have a much more difficult time because they're going into work into really what I would consider, like my nephew Larry, who's on the front line, into dangerous situations almost in this regard. But this could be also a time to take stock of things and to say what's important. How, if you're a parent, what's important to kids, my kids, and what's really important, important to me. The other thing, and I just want to get this in. I've had people tell me that things they'd been interested in years, like painting or doing different things, so they just decided to put aside the time. They felt they never had the time to do that. And so some have looked at some of the hobbies they would have liked to have done, and they've actually probably taken the 2 hours of commuting time to spend time in that way. It's not always easy. It's so easy to think about what you don't have. But that's why I say resilient people really see, what is it that they do have? What is it that they can do?
Go back to the Viktor Frankl comment you made again too. I think a lot of that is about the choices that are made. So it's easy to fill, the commuting time or the lost TSA time with work and feeling as though you're scrambling to be okay. Probably the best, and maybe you can comment on this, the best way to make sure that you're taking stock of those things that would build resilience is to be purposeful with that newfound time, to maybe take some of those tips that you suggested and intentionally make an outreach to somebody, intentionally do something of giving rather than being immediately absorbed into, oh my gosh, I'm in a work-minded crisis type of a mode.
Yeah, the reason I smiled, I cannot tell you how often now I am using the word intentional. With everyone. Like one of the things I said the other night, I gave a talk for parents. I said, make a list of how you would like your children to describe you when the coronavirus subsides. How, during the coronavirus, what words would you hope your kids use to describe you? And then you'll see why I love your word intentional. Then the next slide was, what are you intentionally saying or doing so they are likely to use the words you would like them to use? This could be in any relationship. When I've worked with business leaders, what words would you hope your staff use to describe you? Or your customers or your clients, what are you intentionally saying or doing? So I love the word intentional because you know what? It has to be intentional. It could become more just part of you, but at first, I think it really has to be intentional. How am I responding to this? How am I contributing to the life of others? How am I communicating a brief note of gratitude towards someone?
Absolutely.
And all of these things add up to really resilience for me.
It sounds like it's not a single thing. It's a combination of many, many things that builds resilience over time.
Oh yeah, it's in many different experiences, and hopefully there are many charismatic adults along the way that provide those experiences. There's a concept I use. I say every one of us, both children and adults, have strengths. I call them islands of competence, and I'm always saying to caregivers who are taking care of kids, parents and other caregivers and teachers, notice what your kids' islands of competence are. And then, how can we build upon those? But what are our own strengths and islands of competence? And can we build on those?
I'm going to touch on charismatic adults, which I love that you started to talk with that.
Right.
Two parts of the question. One is that the same as a mentor? Mm-hmm. And then part two of it is, how do you handle situations where in your life, be it a partner, a colleague at work, where there's people that in your life that are acting maybe the exact opposite of what you would describe as a charismatic adult, short of removing them, or maybe that's the right answer, to remove them from your life. How do you handle with the the situation where it's
you'll see why I'm laughing at that question. But the first one, in terms of mentors, the interesting thing to me, Eric, on that is when I've asked people, because some of the research I did, I've gotten everything. Hopefully the parent was a mentor. It was, a charismatic adult. Mentors are very powerful. Like when that Hersh Berkowitz, my supervisor, gave me that little note, "You did a great job today, Bob," that I mentioned before. At that moment, he was a charismatic adult in my life. It could be a colleague, It could be many different people at different ages. Mentors are very important. I really feel that if more of what we call at-risk kids, especially in our schools, had mentors, or kids who were really struggling with emotional and behavioral problems, mentors are just very vital. So they could take any shape or form. That's why I often ask people, who were the charismatic adults in your life growing up and even now? And if you make a list, you could see they're very different. I had a coach when I was growing up, in Brooklyn. There was a middle school coach, at that point it was called junior high, and he would have been one of my charismatic adults, very supportive, always knew when to put his hand around, your shoulder and give you a little encouragement. Your next question, why I was laughing, someone once said to me at a workshop, "Bob, I love the notion of charismatic adults. If they're charismatic adults, are there such people as anti-charismatic adults?" And Eric, I said, "Could you please define the term?" And I just loved it. They suck the energy out of you and they put you down. And I must tell you, I immediately thought of my 5th grade teacher, who to this day, I will not say her name because I'm convinced if I say her name, she may appear. And I'm not taking any chances. All of us have people like that put us down. Sometimes if it's a boss or someone, I have several articles, how to manage your boss, but sometimes it could be an intolerable situation when one of the only solutions is to leave it. If it's not, if it's like a question you raised before, if you're with some people who are more negative, who put you down, especially when we become adults, as much as we might want their approval, a point may be reached, and there are some adults I worked with who finally had to say, "I'm never going to get this person's approval. They're very negative." And what they had control over is really starting to gravitate towards people who were much more the charismatic adult, not the anti-charismatic adult. Where it becomes problematic, and that's a whole other talk, is when I've worked and done, couples therapy, where one member of the couple is very anti-charismatic adult. They're always putting the other one down or whatever. Hopefully it could, therapy could help them, in that. But we do have choices. And that's why the questions I raise, especially when I'm working with people in leadership positions, what words do you hope your staff scribes you, and what words do you hope they will actually use?
I think that's good. If you I'm going to use that with my kids. What words do I want them using about me? I think it applies to business leadership too. What do we want our clients? What do we want our employees? What do we want people saying about us? And then going back to your word, being intentional and purposeful in those actions really gives you the control to impact how people think of you. And I guess that's a good chunk of building resilience.
Yeah, well, what you just said, if you want your kids to describe you as calm during this period and you're flustered all the time, I mean, you can't hide that, but that's why you have to find techniques so that you could at least be as calm and reassuring as you can be. And that doesn't mean you don't tell your kids that at times you get anxious or worried, and it is a very challenging time. But one of the things, just that train of thought, your questions are triggering so much, is when kids are anxious, whatever, we validate what they're feeling and we say it could be scary, but the message of hope, and this part is so important for me, not just for kids, to be able to say, but you know, while scary, there are a lot of people who are trying to help. Doctors who are trying this, researchers, and you know, whatever language your child can understand, there's so many people, very good people out there to try to bring an end to this coronavirus as quickly as possible. That's where even notes of gratitude could be written to certain people.
I'm going to ask this one. I'll try to ask it without getting choked up as I think of my own, charismatic adults in my life here. So I think there's one of the challenges. Many of us have parents who are those charismatic adults in our lives. And of course, in a moment where we're not supposed to be around them, I think there's a lot of people struggling with the idea that I can't go visit, those people, I can't be physically close. So if a person is struggling with that, any suggestions on how to deal with the absence of that important person in their life?
Yeah, we actually have a very close friend, and her mother died in one of the nursing homes at the age of 98. I mean, the mother was certainly elderly, but she couldn't be there. The nursing staff was very helpful. There's where I think it's very important. And again, I really don't want this to sound easy, because you certainly want to be with someone during their dying moments, especially, to be able to say to oneself, and it takes time to say, what I have control over is maybe communicating to the nursing staff, they're saying something or whatever. What unfortunately I don't have any control over is to be able right now to be meeting with my mom or my dad, especially if they're very ill. It's still painful, but sometimes we don't have control. Almost, if you look at the obituary section of the Boston Globe, what does it all say? Because of coronavirus, there's not going to be, really a formal funeral, or a very small one. Some are actually streamed, I saw now, but we will have a memorial service later on. But to know a beloved relative, and especially a parent, is in a nursing home, they're dying, or in a hospital, and you can't see them, I think you have to think about what were all those wonderful experiences you've had with them. What are some of those wonderful memories? And think ahead to, how am I going to really, the memorial service, what am I going to want to say or do? And it's not easy. But again, it gets to personal control. We have no control over that. What we have control over is, how are we going to respect the memory of that parent?
Is it safe to say that, as I'm thinking here, it's not a question up here, but my own question, is it safe to say that resilience is not about the absence of painful things? You keep referencing it multiple times. There's painful things that happen, and more about how you control or respond to the dealing with those. Is that a better way to characterize it?
You don't know how an important question, well, you probably do, an important question that is, because when the field of positive psychology came in, some people misunderstood it. You're focusing just on positive, but no, positive psychology is exactly what you said, Eric. You have to acknowledge the pain. You have to acknowledge there's some unhappy, miserable things going on, but it's how you respond to it. As a matter of fact, based on, the question you raised, in several of my longer workshops, I have a slide that says positive psychology and focusing on positive emotions does not mean you deny the pain or other things. But that's how you cope with them. Because if you try to deny anger, if you try to deny disappointment, it's going to breed in there. It doesn't go away. Then you're just like putting a Band-Aid. But if you could say, I am really upset, I'm really angry with what's going on, I'm really this, whatever. But now, how can I deal with it? How can I cope? You know, talk I'm giving next week has to do with coping strategies, those that are adaptive and those that are, I hate to use jargon, maladaptive. We all cope. Some coping strategies help us to deal with situations more effectively and be resilient. Others do not. I remember I once, one of my sons was on a Little League team. 2 kids struck out every time they were up. One kid went over to the coach and said, "Coach, I'm striking out a lot. Can you help me with my swing?" The other kid, much to the embarrassment of his parents, ran off the field and yelled at the umpire, "You're blind, you're blind, you're blind. I wouldn't strike out if it wasn't for you." Well, think of it. They're both coping, but one is coping by saying, "I can learn." The other, unfortunately, feels hopeless, helpless, whatever, and coping through anger and distancing himself from the activity. So yes, it's accepting those, what I'll call negative feelings, but saying, how do I deal with them in a way that will help me to overcome them or deal more effectively with them?
I'd also say maybe that's a situation, right, where someone is looking inward to find the solution. What can I do better versus the externalizing and blaming of others?
Yeah, exactly. And the one who's looking internally also, though, in the example, sees that coach is a charismatic adult. So they also know when to ask for help, which is a very important thing. We all at times need help. When do we ask for it? So one child entertains the notion there are these charismatic adults out there who can help me. The other, for whatever reason, doesn't see that. And I mean, he yelled at the umpire. He ran off into the woods. It was really, imagine his parents were very embarrassed. I still remember they came over to me and they knew I was a psychologist. I try not to tell people this often. And the Little League goes, "And well, what could you do?" And I said, "You'll have to just go." He was having a real problem. I mean, he had a meltdown over striking out.
Yep. That sounds like me when I was a young kid playing baseball too. So on that note,
I'll give you my card later.
Yeah. We have just a few minutes left. I'm asking one more just easy question, but I do want to point to the slides for those that would like to look at additional information for Dr. Brooks, because we're not going to get to all of these ones. His website's a wealth of information on the topic of resilience. There's videos and articles. I would encourage everybody to jot that down and go visit. One of the questions, just a really simple one, Bob, is everybody loved the slides. I got lots of questions here just saying how great this was, how timely it was. Many text messages saying the same thing. Is it okay if we share these slide decks with anybody that would like them?
Definitely. No, I love to share this. For me, a lot of the questions come up after, like if you're like me, they come up 2 hours, 3 hours, or a day after. So if people have the slides, even the Brooks family slide, I think it really, I think sometimes it stirs up, things, and the slides may lead them to particular articles on my website. So I really, maybe.
I think we'll have, I'll bet you we have about 200 family reunions that are a result of this session.
Oh, it was really fun, crazy, I'll say, because we all like to talk, but on that. But I want to tell just, and this, having the opportunity to do this, Eric and Rick, and really, it's really uplifting for me too, because I then feel at least there's something I'm doing, if you know what I mean, and can reach out to people, and then I know people comment back. So thank you for helping me to be a little more resilient by doing these things.
Well, thank you. Yeah, we'll get wrapping up here, Rick. I don't know if you want to say any final thoughts. I'll just say one, and then if you want to say anything. Thank you again, Bob, for presenting today. This was again very timely. For those that want additional information, either from us or from Dr. Brooks, there'll be a follow-up email with a survey, and it'll also promote the names of the charities and places that you can go to be resilient and give to them as two fantastic organizations. And then our next webinar is going to be on May 13th with a focus on business leadership and traction, which is an EOS operating system for business, which I think, especially in a moment like this, is a really good opportunity for people to learn what systems they should put into their business and make them run more effectively. So, Rick, do you want to say any final thoughts? Or
you're good. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, Rick, and thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
On behalf of Rick and everyone else here at CFG, thank you again, and everybody have a great day.